Across the coal counties of Appalachia, there are mines that were not simply abandoned when the coal ran out. They were sealed after disasters so severe that recovery crews never finished the job, sealed deliberately to starve underground fires of oxygen, or sealed because a river broke through and no one ever wanted to go back. In several cases, the bodies of the men who died inside are still there today, entombed in workings that have never been reopened. This video counts down 11 real mines across Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky. Every mine on this list is documented in state archives, federal mine safety records, and historical markers that still stand at the sites today. In nearly every case, official investigators could state how the disaster happened, but never fully explained why it happened, and in several cases the bodies of the dead were never brought back to the surface at all. Stay with me to the end, because the 11th mine on this list is the one that gave this video its title. Its official cause was never determined. 19 of its dead were never recovered, and to this day no one has been able to explain why it happened. Let's begin. In the steep terrain of Tazewell County, Virginia, the Pocahontas coalfield was barely 3 years old when, at 1:30 in the morning on March 13, 1884, an explosion tore through the Laurel mine with enough force to knock houses off their foundations 300 feet from the entrance. Inside, at least 112 miners died instantly, their bodies so badly mangled that some were missing heads or limbs entirely. A fire broke out in the wreckage afterward, and rather than risk more lives fighting it underground, the mine's operators made the decision to flood the workings with water and steam and seal the entrance completely, with all of the dead still inside. For nearly a month, the mine sat sealed while the fire burned itself out beneath the flood. It was not until April of 1884 that crews reopened the Laurel mine, recovered the bodies, and began the slow process of identification and burial. The miners were laid to rest in what became the Pocahontas Cemetery, a burial ground that still holds gravestones inscribed in Hungarian, Italian, Polish, and Russian, a record of just how many nationalities had been drawn to this remote Virginia mountain town to dig coal. The original Pocahontas mine has since been converted into a tourist attraction, one of the first of its kind in the country, where visitors can walk through a portion of the seam that was once worked by the men who died in 1884. But the Laurel mine itself, the section where the explosion occurred, was never fully reopened in the way the rest of the field was, and much of what happened in the hours before that fire still relies on second-hand testimony rather than a definitive official record. The Eccles mine, 4 miles from present-day Beckley, West Virginia, was considered one of the safer operations in the New River coal field when, at around 2:10 in the afternoon on April 28, 1914, a contractor blasted through a barrier of coal that had been deliberately left in place to keep 2 sections of the mine ventilated. The blast cut the ventilation entirely. Methane built up in the unventilated section within hours, and when another miner's open carbide lamp reached it, the resulting explosion killed every one of the 174 men working in Eccles No. 5 that day. The connected Eccles No. 6 mine filled with the same toxic afterdamp, killing 9 more men there. Recovery crews needed 4 days just to reach the first bodies. The destruction was so severe that many of the dead could not be identified at all. Unidentified miners, a number of them recent immigrants, were buried together above the tipple in a burial ground that locals came to call the Polish Cemetery, separate from the identified dead who went to family plots or to St. Sebastian Cemetery in nearby Beckley. It would be more than 60 years before those unidentified miners were moved. In 1976, their remains were relocated to a new memorial cemetery, built specifically to honor the victims of both the 1914 disaster and a second explosion that struck the same mine 12 years later, killing 19 more men in 1926. The Eccles Disaster Memorial Cemetery stands today as one of the only sites in Appalachia where the unidentified dead of a mining disaster were eventually given a permanent, named resting place, more than half a century after the ground first closed over them. Near the village of Coal Glen in Chatham County, North Carolina, the Deep River coalfield was never large by Appalachian standards, but on the morning of May 27, 1925, it produced the deadliest industrial accident in North Carolina's history. At about 9:30 a.m., an explosion tore through the mine, almost certainly triggered by an improperly set blasting charge that ignited a cloud of coal dust. Mine Superintendent Howard Butler and a mechanic went underground to investigate and found several unconscious miners near a ventilation door. As they carried the men out and went back in for more, a second explosion injured Butler and forced both men to crawl back to the surface. Minutes later, a third explosion collapsed part of the main shaft entirely, sealing off the passage and trapping anyone still inside. 53 men were eventually confirmed dead, roughly split between white and black miners, though local researchers have long suspected the real number was higher, since several miners scheduled for that shift were unmarried men whose absence might never have been formally reported. Several mules killed in the blast were never brought to the surface either, their remains left in the collapsed sections alongside whatever equipment could not be salvaged. The mine was eventually repaired enough to resume limited operations, but it never recovered the scale it once had. By 1953, the Coal Glen mine was permanently closed, and not long after, the workings flooded and were left to fill with water for good. A North Carolina state historical marker was finally placed at the site in 2017, 92 years after the disaster, marking ground that today sits quiet and wooded, with almost no visible trace remaining of the shaft that once ran nearly 1,000 feet beneath it. The No. 6 mine of the Sunday Creek Coal Company, just outside Millfield, Ohio, was considered the company's best and safest operation in the Hocking Valley region, and on November 5, 1930, the company's own top executives were touring it specifically to show off newly installed safety equipment. At around 11:45 that morning, while the executives were roughly a mile and a half into the mine, an electrical arc between a fallen trolley wire and the rail ignited a buildup of methane gas. The explosion killed 82 men that day, including the company's president and 4 other senior officials who had come underground to inspect the very improvements meant to prevent exactly this kind of accident. Most of the dead were found to have died from carbon monoxide poisoning rather than the blast itself, and it took rescue crews until November 9, 4 days later, to fully clear the mine's lower sections of gas. 19 miners barricaded themselves behind a makeshift partition deep in the mine and survived for hours before being found alive, a detail that became one of the few hopeful notes in what remains the worst mining disaster in Ohio's history. The mine itself reopened about a month after the explosion and continued operating until 1945, when it finally closed for good. For decades afterward, the old shaft entrance sat quietly on private land, its tipple slowly falling apart until the main shaft collapsed on its own in 2012, opening a sinkhole at the surface. The state of Ohio undertook a formal sealing project the following year, permanently closing the entrance for good nearly 83 years after the disaster, this time not because of an explosion, but because the ground itself finally gave way. The Fratterville mine, in the Coal Creek Valley of Anderson County, Tennessee, had operated for more than 30 years without a major incident when, at roughly 7:20 on the morning of May 19, 1902, a methane explosion ripped through the workings, almost certainly triggered by gas that had leaked in from an adjacent, unventilated mine. Of the 216 men and boys who had entered that morning, the disaster left only 3 adult men in the entire town still alive. Some miners died instantly in the blast. Others, trapped deeper in the mine and unable to reach the entrance, built makeshift barricades against the spreading gas and waited, knowing rescue would not come in time. Several of them used what little time they had left to write final messages to their families on whatever paper they had, some of which were recovered from their bodies days later. One read simply that he wished for one more breath, asking to be remembered as long as his wife lived. The official cause of the explosion was investigated by Tennessee's Commissioner of Labor at the time, but was ultimately never fully determined or publicly disclosed in detail, beyond pointing to the likely buildup of gas over a weekend when the mine's ventilation furnace had been shut down. 89 of the dead were buried together in a circle around a central monument at Leech Cemetery, a site now known as the Fratterville Miners' Circle and listed on the National Register of Historic Places. 30 more itinerant miners, never claimed by any family, were buried nearby in unmarked graves that a local historical foundation only confirmed using ground-penetrating radar more than a century later. On January 27, 1959, in the village of Port Griffith, Pennsylvania, the Susquehanna River broke through the thin rock roof of the Knox Coal Company's River Slope mine, a roof that company management had ordered thinned to barely 6 feet, far below the 35-foot minimum considered safe at the time, in an effort to extract a few more tons of coal close to the riverbed. Water poured into the workings with such force that it created a visible whirlpool on the surface of the river, swallowing railroad cars and anything else nearby. 69 miners escaped through interconnected shafts and air vents, some climbing 50 feet up an old emergency shaft to reach safety. 12 men did not make it out. It took 3 days just to plug the hole in the riverbed, accomplished by dumping dozens of railroad cars and hundreds of smaller mine cars directly into the flooded breach until the flow finally slowed enough for crews to seal it permanently with concrete poured through boreholes drilled from above. An estimated 10 billion gallons of river water eventually filled the interconnected mines beneath the valley. The 12 men who died were never recovered. Their bodies remain somewhere in the flooded workings beneath Port Griffith to this day, and the disaster effectively ended large-scale deep coal mining in the northern anthracite field of Pennsylvania almost overnight. Several mine officials and company owners were later indicted on charges of involuntary manslaughter for ordering the excavation that thinned the rock cover in the first place. But for the families of the 12 men still underground, no recovery effort ever proved possible. The Fairmont Coal Company's interconnected No. 6 and No. 8 mines in Monongah, West Virginia, were sharing a single ventilation system by design to save on construction costs when at 10:28 on the morning of December 6, 1907, an explosion tore through No. 8 and immediately raced through the shared ventilation into No. 6 as well. The blast was felt up to 8 miles away, knocked streetcars off their rails, and destroyed the ventilation fans in both mines simultaneously, trapping toxic gas inside long after the initial explosion had passed. The official death toll was recorded at 362, making it the deadliest mining disaster in American history, but officials at the time admitted the real number was almost certainly higher, since many unregistered workers, including children who had come into the mine to help their fathers, were never formally counted among the dead. Investigators were never able to agree on a single definitive cause, citing only the general dangers of an open flame lamp, a blown-out blasting charge, or an electrical arc igniting a methane and coal dust mixture that proved unusually severe given the scale of the destruction. More than 250 women were widowed, and over 500 children lost their fathers in a town that at the time was made up largely of recent immigrants from Italy, Hungary, Poland, and the Russian Empire. The disaster was severe enough that it directly led Congress to establish the United States Bureau of Mines in 1910. A statue known as the Monongah Heroine, honoring the widows left behind, was unveiled in the town square in 2007, a century after the explosion, but the precise spark that caused America's deadliest mine disaster has never been conclusively identified. The Scotia mine, near Oven Fork in Letcher County, Kentucky, had not been considered an especially gassy mine when, shortly before noon on March 9, 1976, a methane explosion tore through its workings, killing 15 men. 2 days later, while rescue and recovery teams, including federal mine safety inspectors, were still working underground to retrieve the bodies and assess the damage, a second explosion struck the same area, killing 11 more, among them 3 of the federal inspectors who had come to investigate the first blast. With the Farmington disaster in West Virginia still fresh in public memory from less than a decade earlier, federal officials made the decision to seal the mine completely rather than risk more lives in further recovery attempts. Scotia remained sealed for 243 days through the spring, summer, and into mid-November of 1976, before it was finally reopened and the remaining bodies brought out. A federal investigative report into the disaster was completed shortly afterward, but it was not released to the public for 16 years, remaining sealed by court order until 1993. The widows of the miners killed in the first explosion later sued the mine's parent company, a case that wound through federal courts for years before a settlement was reached in 1980. A congressional committee that reviewed the disaster concluded that the mine had placed production ahead of the safety of the men working inside it, a finding that, even decades later, still defines how the Scotia disaster is remembered in eastern Kentucky. In May of 1962, the Town Council of Appalachia, Pennsylvania, hired volunteer firefighters to burn off trash at the town's landfill, a strip mine pit that had been left open since around 1935 and was being used informally as a dump. The fire was doused that night, but flared up again days later, and at some point it found its way through an unsealed 15-foot hole in the pit into the labyrinth of abandoned anthracite mines running beneath the entire town. To this day, historians and former residents still disagree on the precise mechanism. Some maintain the 1962 landfill fire alone was responsible. Others insist it reignited an earlier, never fully extinguished colliery fire from 1932 that had simply been smoldering beneath the surface for 3 decades, waiting for an opening. By August of 1962, carbon monoxide levels detected underground forced the permanent closure of every active mine in the area. Multiple firefighting attempts throughout the 1960s and 1970s, including one effort to dig a containment trench, ran out of funding or were defeated by weather before they could stop the fire's spread. In 1984, Congress allocated more than $40 million to relocate the town's residents. And in 1992, the state of Pennsylvania condemned every remaining property through eminent domain. A handful of residents were eventually allowed to remain for the rest of their lives under a court agreement, but ownership of their homes reverts to the state when they pass away. The fire, by every official estimate, is still burning today, more than 6 decades after it started, somewhere beneath the empty streets and the famous graffiti-covered stretch of abandoned highway that now draws visitors from around the world. The Sago mine in Upshur County, West Virginia, had just reopened after the New Year's holiday weekend when, at around 6:30 on the morning of January 2006, an explosion struck deep inside its sealed-off areas that had passed a fire boss inspection only 40 minutes earlier. 14 miners on a second cart escaped the blast. 12 men on the first cart, who had already passed the point of the explosion, were trapped behind it. A rescue attempt was made almost immediately, led by the mine's own superintendent, but carbon monoxide levels 9,000 feet into the mine forced the rescue team to turn back before they could reach the trapped men. For nearly 2 days, conflicting and ultimately false reports that all 12 miners had been found alive spread through the media and to the miners' families before the truth was confirmed. Only one of the 12 survived. Investigators later determined that a thunderstorm passing over the area that morning had likely triggered a lightning strike that ignited methane behind a set of mine seals. Seals that, it turned out, had been built using a foam-based material rather than the solid concrete blocks federal regulations were intended to require. The exact path the lightning took into the mine, and why the seals failed as quickly as they did, was never resolved to everyone's satisfaction, and the disaster led directly to a nationwide moratorium on the type of foam seal used at Sago. Of all the disasters on this list, it remains the most recent, a reminder that even with modern monitoring and inspection standards, the same essential mystery, an ignition source no one can fully account for, is still capable of sealing a mine forever. The Consul Number 9 mine, known to generations of local miners simply as Number 9, sat in the Pittsburgh coal seam between Farmington and Mannington, West Virginia, and by 1968 it was one of the largest coal mines in the country, its tunnels stretching roughly 10 miles long and 6 miles wide beneath the surrounding hills. At 5:30 on the morning of November 20th, 1968, an explosion tore through the mine with enough force to be felt by a motel clerk 12 miles away in Fairmont. Of the 99 men working underground that morning, 21 managed to escape through smoke-filled passages in the first hours. The other 78 did not. Rescue crews worked for days against fires that continued burning underground, flames that at one point shot 150 feet into the air from the mine's portal. By November 29th, air samples drawn from boreholes showed the atmosphere inside could no longer sustain human life. The following day, with the family's knowledge but without their direct input on the decision, the mine was sealed shut with concrete to starve the fires of oxygen, entombing all 78 men inside. Almost a year later, in September of 1969, the mine was reopened in an attempt to recover the bodies, a recovery effort that continued on and off for nearly a decade. By 1978, 59 men had been brought out. 19 were never found, and the No 9 mine remains their grave to this day. Investigators were never able to determine a definitive cause for the original explosion, though later evidence suggested a safety alarm on one of the mine's ventilation fans had been disabled before the blast, an alarm that, had it worked, might have warned the crew in time. The disaster directly led to the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969, and 8 years later, to the creation of the Mine Safety and Health Administration. To this day, a memorial service is still held every November at the site in Mannington, where the bodies of 19 men remain exactly where they were left, sealed in the ground beneath a hillside that on the surface looks like nothing more than a quiet stretch of West Virginia countryside. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let us know which of these 11 mines affected you the most, and we'll see you in the next one.